All right, looks like we are live on Facebook, and looks like we are live on Zoom. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning into tonight's Popping the Science Bubble. The Berkeley Public Library is delighted to have a partnership with the Popping the Science Bubble team, and thank you so much for attending tonight. So Popping the Science Bubble is a monthly seminar series that aims to share new research findings from grad students and postdocs at UC Berkeley with the general public and create constructive discussion about a variety of science topics. We have 2 speakers at each seminar who will talk about their current research or a topic that they find really interesting. The organizers are 3 graduate students at UC Berkeley, Jenna, Madison, and Oksana. And the program happens on the 3rd Tuesday of every month. If you are interested in checking out their past seminars, you can visit their website, check out their Twitter or Facebook, and sign up for the listserv to keep in the loop for upcoming seminars. Our YouTube channel is a fantastic place too. The Popping the Science YouTube channel has previous speakers, so if you want to treat yourself to some past videos, those are there. Also, this video is being recorded and will be put on YouTube as well. All right, I'll let our Science Bubble team take it away and introduce tonight's speakers.
Okay, thanks, Kelsey, and thanks for sharing that. Yeah, if you all want to keep posted on our latest seminars, sign up for the listserv. We only send a couple of emails a month for upcoming seminars, and then as a follow-up, where you can also learn about our speakers and their interests in research. So to just explain the format of the seminar, both of our speakers will talk about their research, and you can ask questions either in the chat box or the Q&A box, and Madison, Oksana, or I will read the questions in real time to the speakers, and there will be a little bit of time at the end of each speaker's talk to also ask more questions. So don't be shy, feel free to type in the chat, and with that, we'll take it away for the introduction of our first speaker, Dr. Knudsen.
Yeah, so our first speaker is Eric Knudsen. He grew up just outside Santa Cruz in Felton, California, and then moved out to South Dakota to receive his bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. Then went to Philadelphia and got his doctorate in biomedical engineering from Drexel University. And he studied how the brain learns to control a brain-machine interface, and then came back to the home state of California, where he's currently a postdoctoral scholar at UC Berkeley, studying how the brain supports flexible decision-making and learning in real time. He enjoys reading, lifting weights, and being a father. And we're excited to learn about his research on the hippocampus. So please take it away, Eric. Oh,
okay, there we go. I am not muted anymore. So hello, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to share my work. It's really nice to be able to communicate the science to a wide range of people that aren't necessarily within our own little silos that we have in our research bubbles. So I titled my talk today, Getting Lost in Thought, How the Hippocampus Maps the Unseen World in Our Heads.
Eric, sorry.
So
I currently don't see your slides.
Oh my gosh.
For other people. No, you're good.
All right, there we go.
All right,
I was wondering about that one. Cool. Yeah, so basically, the point of this talk is to share a little bit about my research, a little bit of history on what we know about hippocampal function, and how it pertains to us being able to navigate our environments in an adaptive manner. So yeah, I'm in the Helen Wills Neuroscience Institute. I'm in the lab of Dr. Joni Wallace. So we study things like decision-making, learning, working memory, just general cognitive processes that underlie behavior. So before we can understand what the unseen world is that I'm talking about in my title, we have to understand how our brains sort of use understand the physical world that we live in. So this is an example that everybody should be familiar with. This is a map, obviously, of a neighborhood. And so we use a map to navigate our world. So let's say I moved to this neighborhood and I'm not really familiar with the surroundings. I live down here in the red circle, and say a friend lives up in the blue circle. Now, I might not know how to get there, so I'll ask my friend for directions, and she'll say, turn left here, turn right here, take another right, and you'll make it. So just by following those directions, I can get from point A to point B. But if something happens in the environment, I need to be able to adapt that behavior. So as I live there, I take that route more and more, familiarize myself with the local surroundings. I'm able to flexibly adapt. So if I see there's a traffic accident on my usual route, I'll then instead, I know I can take a left up here, go straight through the intersection, take another left, and that will still get me to my same destination. So there are really two components to being able to do this. First is memory. So memory is sort of an integration of our experiences over time. So the more I experience this environment, I have a memory of the area. And there's also this idea of place component. So where am I in relation to everything else in this environment? So you can't really navigate a map if you don't know where you are to start. So now I'm going to take you through a little bit of the neuroscience history of how people sort of figured out the hippocampus was responsible for these two different ideas. So first is memory. So way back in the 1950s, there was a young man, we'll just call him HM. This is what he's been referred to in the literature. But he suffered a severe head injury, and he basically was plagued by severe seizures. It basically ruined, it made his life very difficult. He had to quit his job and so forth. So he got desperate. He went to a neurosurgeon. And in those days, what a neurosurgeon did most was something called a lobotomy. These are basically going in surgically and removing a portion of the brain. And this has been used for any number of different things, some good and some bad. But this guy, Scoville was his name, basically said, I can cure your seizures. So I've done a lot of these surgeries in psychiatric patients, and this has been shown to cure seizures. So what he did was surgically go in and actually remove the hippocampus from this man's brain. So this is a 3D reconstruction of this patient HM's brain, sort of done after the fact. So this man donated his body to science. He's probably one of the most studied brains in the field of neuroscience. But essentially what you see here is these sort of dark red areas of the brain. That's the portion of the brain that was removed. So he woke up from anesthesia. He underwent a number of evaluations. He didn't have any differences in terms of his temperament or his regular disposition. The seizures were cured, just as the doctor promised, but there was sort of an unfortunate side effect that he could no longer remember anything that had happened to him after the surgery. So, when somebody would ask him what he had for lunch, he had no idea. Someone introduced themselves to them, and then 5 minutes later, you ask him what their name was, he would have no idea. So this idea that the hippocampus is involved in memory, was not really known up until this point. And so, as neuroscientists, what we want to do is then put this in an experimental system. So in a way we can test this is in animals. Obviously, we can't experiment on humans as much as we did in the 1950s. So you develop a series of tests, and you want to adapt your tests to sort of the strengths and the skills of whatever animal model you're working in. So a lot of this work was done in rodents. So you can put an animal in, this is called a Y maze. There's all different configurations, different types of maze. But essentially what you're doing is you're putting a little treat in each one of these arms, and you're asking the animal to explore this maze. And so he'll go walk down here, take the left arm, get a treat. He knows where he came from. He knows there's no treat there. So he'll then explore the other arm and get another treat. And so this is the idea of good spatial memory now. So these animals have what's called a spatial memory. Now, when they went in and did a sort of an experimental lesion, so they got rid of the hippocampus of these rats and then asked them to do the same task, they essentially lost the ability to remember where they had been. So they just sort of wandered aimlessly all over. They didn't remember where the rewards were within the maze and so forth. So the question then became for neuroscientists, what is the contribution of the neurons in the brain? So this is what I do as a scientist, is basically ask questions: what are individual neurons in the brain doing to account for the behaviors that we're observing? So a guy in the 1970s by the name of John O'Keefe, he received the Nobel Prize about 10 years ago for this work. He did this experiment again. He put the animals in a Y maze and just sort of let them freely roam around while recording the activity of hippocampal neurons in their brains. What he found was that, surprisingly, these neurons were sort of active at distinct portions of this maze. So each one of these little cross-hatched areas that you're seeing reflects sort of the active zone of a neuron within this brain. So every time the rat would enter, say, this zone -16 here, there was one neuron in his brain that was firing. And so that's this idea of place. So place within an environment is encoded by the individual neurons in the hippocampus. So what I'm going to show you now is just a video that somebody has put together of a similar experiment, but now a rat's going to be moving around a square environment. So what you're going to see, each one of these colored dots represents the action potential, so the firing of an individual neuron, and they're coded by color here. So each color represents a different cell that you're recording from. And you'll see this little rat moving around. It's going to be zoomed, sped up quite a bit. So as this animal sort of moves around, these cells are spatially active. So every time he goes into this corner, this pink cell fires. Down in this corner, the red cell fires, and so forth. And so over time, as he explores more and more of the environment, we see more and more of a tiling of this space. So this sort of leads to the conclusion then that the place cells map the environment. So you think of an environment as not just being the physical topography of it, so the land itself, but also the things that are in the environment. So things like obstacles. So this is a whole system that's devoted to understanding the animal's position relative to all the different things within the environment, all the sensory conditions of the environment. So, although they sort of, the synthesis or the origin of these two different lines of research were from this one patient, they tended to sort of co-evolve together. And there's always been sort of a gap between the work in memory, which has primarily taken place in humans using non-invasive means, and place. So place has been studied primarily in the rodent model, and it's been done sort of in the context of animals walking around and navigating in environments. So in order to get at that unseen world that I mentioned before, I'd like to ask the audience a few questions. So the first question, so this is from The Simpsons. It's just a simple question about family. So if I tell you that Lisa, the little girl in the middle, is Marge's daughter, and Patty over here on the right is Marge's sister, what is the relationship between Lisa and Patty? And, if you want to answer in the chat, that's fine. It should be a fairly straightforward answer. But we have this idea in our minds of a family tree. And so when we hear these two different relations, what you can hopefully conclude or infer from the information that I've given you is that Patty is Lisa's aunt. And so this is a form of structure that we have in our heads that is not necessarily spatially oriented in any way, but it is still a set of relationships that we use to navigate, in this case, the family relations between individual members of the family. And the important thing here is, you didn't need to know any extra information to make this inference. You didn't need to know that Homer was married to Marge. You didn't need to know that Bart was Lisa's brother or anything like that. You could just basically jump from this node to this node and make the inference based on that. So that's one type of sort of unseen knowledge that has structure to it. So another example is this question. So if I say a scooter has better gas mileage than a coupe, and a coupe has better gas mileage than a truck, and then ask the question, does the scooter or the truck have better gas mileage? hopefully you'll quickly answer that the scooter has better gas mileage than the truck. And so this is another form of inference called transitive inference. Essentially, if I know two of these three relationships and I know that they're all related, I can infer the third relationship simply by the structure of sort of the relationship between all these different vehicles. So this is kind of the question that we ask, that I've been asking in the lab. So let's get rid of the cars and move on to sort of a series of just random natural stimuli. So if I take each one of these pictures and then I associate them with a percent or probability of getting a reward. So for instance, this picture with the leaves would get a reward. If I chose it, I would get rewarded 90% of the time. The picture of the road would be rewarded 50% of the time. And this picture up here of the bricks would be 10% of the time. And now, importantly, so the way we do these tasks is we just ask a series of questions. So a series of choices between these different pictures. So a typical trial in our task will look like this. You just sort of maintain a fixation. Two pictures will typically come up on the screen. And all the subject has to do is just look at the picture he ultimately wants to choose. And when he does choose that, he'll get the outcome associated with that picture. Okay. So the extra wrinkle, so I mean, these kinds of tasks have been done fairly classically in neuroscience, probing all different sorts of things. People have primarily focused on the prefrontal cortex for this. But basically, I changed the task a little bit. So, each picture has an initial value associated with it, but then the values start to move around. So not only does the animal have to learn the initial reward contingencies or likelihood of getting a reward for each picture, they then need to sort of maintain knowledge about the relationship of these pictures as they change over time. So they might, picture one here might move down to 50% after a certain amount of time, then down to 10%, and then back up to back to its original configuration at 90%. So that's the experiment. Oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. And so the important thing to note that just like the car example I gave before, these different pictures have sort of a relational component to them. And so what we can do is sort of make these pictures into a track, if you will, that a subject can move through without actually physically moving, right? Just a series of choices between two of the three images. The subject can move along this track over the course of a couple hours. And so this is what we did. These are the contingencies we actually use. So we used a circular track. So essentially think of this akin to a rat moving around on a circular track. We've now got a sort of cognitive track, if you will, which the subject is moving along. Each dot here represents a single trial. And so he moves around this track, and these are just sort of offset for visualization, but he's just making multiple laps around this track. And then again, recording the activity of hippocampal neurons just to see what they do. And so the big take-home message that we found is, even though the subjects aren't moving around like a rat moving around a track or in an environment, we saw that hippocampal neurons were also forming place fields within this abstract value space. And yeah, so I mean, this is kind of the take-home message of this, how do we get from a rat moving around an environment to navigating a complex cognitive problem? It seems to be instantiated by the same neural circuitry that we see in the rat. And so what this is doing is basically forming a bridging that gap that I mentioned between memory of, past experience along this track in a cognitive domain and sort of the place component. Where am I within this cognitive space? So I'll skip over. I mean, we did test a number of other hypotheses in this paper, and we found a lot of the same properties of place cells were conserved. So that's what this slide is. Yeah, so I'll just go ahead and wrap it up. Just in conclusion, like I said before at the start of the talk, we can navigate life through a series of stimulus response mappings. So, just following directions, left, right. But as we begin to explore more and more our environment, our behavior is gradually allowed to adapt We can take multiple routes to that environment depending on the conditions within the current time. And so generally speaking, this adaptive behavior relies on the understanding of the structure of the world, whether it's, traffic conditions, the weather, the streets in the neighborhood that you're moving through. So this structure comprises what we call a cognitive map. And the hippocampus constructs these maps, they enable flexible goal-directed behaviors that just can't happen in the absence of the hippocampus. So I think that's my time. With that, I'll thank the Wallace Lab. Joni's the PI, and these are all the other folks in the lab with me. And our funding sources are primarily National Institutes of Mental Health and National Institute of Drug Abuse. And I guess we can open it up for questions now.
Great, thank you so much, Eric. To everyone in the audience, you are free to add questions in the chat or Q&A. But if I could start us off with a question.
Sure.
There was that video of a rat, right, where it's exploring and different neurons fire for like different regions of exploratory. But if that rat was, say, going to someone else's house, like it had an actual direction, would it be continually firing the neuron that represents both the direction that it's going, or like the place that it's going to, and the place that it's currently in? Or would it still be more firing for its like immediate surroundings? I don't know if they did an experiment. I realize that's.
I mean, it's a great question. It's a big question, and people have tried to address this. How this system sort of scales to bigger environments is a great thing. Michael Yartseff at the university, he's in HWNI. He studies bats in the place cell system. And so one of the things he did when he was in Israel was basically he would instrument bats with recording systems, and he would let them fly, hundreds of miles, and then basically look at the data and see what they did. And, it basically scaled up to that system. And so, the size of the individual receptive fields, the size of the place field itself can vary pretty widely. I know now he's got I think it's something like a 10-meter square facility that he records bats flying in around now. And yeah, it really depends on the species. It depends on a number of things. But, another aspect of this is that there is sort of a zoo, if you will, of different kinds of place cells within the hippocampus. So people have found things like head direction cells, which would kind of get your direction. So they'll only fire if the animal is moving along a certain trajectory, but not in the other way or the other direction. So yeah, I mean, it's something that people have studied for sure. And yeah, I think it kind of accounts for the size and the destination. Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
I have a question about the experiment that you presented from your paper. So the more complicated cognitive map test. So did you have like volunteers basically like look at this map? Was it like a series of tests on a computer, basically a series of choices, and they would like have to select one of the three and the computer would record the choices? Like how did this experiment
exactly work? Yeah. So this is, you can kind of think of it like a very rudimentary video game. So you're sitting in a chair just staring at a computer screen. There's a small camera underneath that watches your eye. And, as you make a saccade, you make a look, you look at the target, you maintain a fixation for a certain period of time, so half a second, then the computer will register that as your choice.
Okay, very cool. I hope it wasn't too hard to recruit enough volunteers to get enough information.
All right, so it seems like maybe there aren't currently any questions coming through the chat or Q&A, but those are open for anyone to ask any questions that do come up for Eric to respond to in the chat, if that's all right with you, Eric, through the rest of the next talk, if you still have it. And we'll also have some time after Daniel's talk for questions as well. So Oksana will now introduce our second speaker. Thank you very much, Eric.
All right, thanks everybody.
Our second speaker today is Daniel, who is a first-year astrophysics grad student at Berkeley. He is from Downers Grove, Illinois, one of the southwest suburbs of Chicago, and he did his undergrad at Northwestern University in physics as part of the Integrated Science program. His research is all about astronomical explosions and other high-energy phenomena. Outside of research, Daniel plays a lot of Dungeons and Dragons and enjoys listening to podcasts. Thank you for volunteering to speak with us. Take it away.
All righty, let me share my presentation. Hopefully everybody can see that. Yeah, so as I was just introduced, I'm Daniel Bradhauer. I'm a first-year astrophysics grad student at Berkeley, and so today I will be talking about supernovae, and so how astronomers use them to understand the stars that they come from. And so let's start with laying some of the groundwork. I'm going to be focusing on these three main things. How am I collecting my evidence? What exactly is a supernova? And how can we use this evidence that we collect to understand exactly what happened? And so to begin, the title of my talk may have spoiled it, but supernovae are the deaths of stars. And so my job is to investigate the quote unquote crime scene to understand what the life of the star was like before it died. However, unlike real life detectives, I can't travel to the crime scene. I have to look through a telescope in order to collect evidence. And so in astronomy, our evidence is light. How much of it, what kinds of light, where it's coming from, and we use all of that information to understand the supernova and therefore the star that came before it. And so all light can be broken down into individual units of light called photons. And so in order to get as much of the story as possible, astronomers, quote unquote, interview as many witnesses as we can get, meaning that we look at as many different kinds of light as we can using different telescopes. And so on the left, we have the NuSTAR and Chandra telescopes, which look at X-ray light, the same kind of stuff that doctors use to look at your bones. And then in the middle, there are the Lick and Pan-STARRS observatories, which look at the same light that you're using to see me talk to you right now. It's called optical light. And then lastly on the right is the gigantic radio dishes of the VLA, or the acronym stands for the Very Large Array, which looks at the same light that your phone uses to communicate with cell phone towers, or your car radio uses to know what kind of music to play. And so ultimately, the key property that is different between all of these different kinds of light is called the light's wavelength. And so light is a wave, and so its wavelength is the distance between two peaks of that wave. And so it's like when you throw a pebble into a calm pond and you see ripples spreading out, the distance between any two of those ripples is that wavelength. And so the typical wavelength of light that the VLA sees, the radio one, is about the length of your arm spread out from side to side. Optical light, the ones that Lick and Pan-STARRS observe, are much, 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 much smaller, with a wavelength around 600 nanometers, which means you could fit about 100 of them end to end in a single human hair. Then there's the X-rays, the Chandra and NuSTAR ones, and those are even smaller. Instead of fitting about 100 in a human hair, you could fit about 1 million of them in a human hair. So where does the evidence that we collect come from before a star explodes? So the light that we see begins its journey in the very center of a star. And so every star creates light by smashing together elements and turning them into heavier ones in a process called fusion. And so in the sun, at the center, it is smashing together the simplest element, hydrogen, to create the next simplest element, helium. And so every time this happens, a little bit of energy is released in the form of light. And so that light then tries to escape, but it collides with hydrogen on the way out, pushing that hydrogen outwards. And this process repeats itself countless times. And that push is key to how stars operate, because they spend their entire lives on a scale trying to maintain the balance of the outward pressure from light trying to leave and the inward pressure of gravity trying to pull all the hydrogen together. And so think of it like walking down a busy sidewalk in the opposite direction of a tourist group, and you keep bumping into them over and over, and they're slowing you down, but you're also slowing them down. And so typically, to give a sense of scale of what's going on, light takes between about a few 100,000 years to a few million years in order to go from the center of the sun to hitting the surface. So that's about the time that humans were figuring out exactly how to use fire. And so the point of all of this is just to emphasize that light bouncing around the star is playing a key role in that balance the star seeks to maintain. And so typically what happens in the star, as I mentioned earlier, is that, the multiple hydrogen atoms around the center are fusing together to make helium and light. And so that helium is heavier than hydrogen. And so it sinks to the star's core, much like a rock sinks in water. And so eventually, though, the star runs out of hydrogen fuel and is no longer able to produce light. And so without that outward pressure from the light, the scale becomes unbalanced and gravity begins to take over and it crushes down on the star, making it smaller. This process actually heats up the star as it shrinks, which then ignites the helium and begins to fuse that helium that's built up in the core. And so the fusion of helium creates carbon and light, which then restores that balance that I've been talking about. And if the star is massive enough, this whole process will happen again when all the helium is used up to make carbon, and then also when all the carbon is used up to make neon, and so on down the periodic table, forming all those layers that you see in the diagram on the left. That is until iron is made. Iron is what signals the end of a star, as instead of releasing light when it's made, it absorbs it. And so essentially, think of it like light is holding a rope. It's connected to a giant pulley with a large weight, and then iron just runs up and cuts the rope with a pair of scissors, sending the weight crashing down to the ground. And so to give another sense of scale, if we compress the lifetime of a star down to 1 calendar year, where 1201, January 1st, is its birth, and midnight on December 31st is when the star explodes as a supernova, the star is fusing hydrogen all the way up until December 11th, and then it makes all the rest of the elements in those layers up until the last 200th of a second before midnight on December 31st, when it begins to make silicon, which is the very last step before it makes iron. And so once it begins to make iron, the star then collapses in on itself, and some of that material, as it collapses, rebounds and ejects a huge amount of gas and dust into the universe, while at the same time pumping out so much light that the supernova outshines the entire galaxy that it resides in by thousands of times. And so all of that material is extremely hot, and it glows like a hot metal rod as it whizzes by and produces all the light that I was talking about earlier. And so now, with the death of the star, the crime scene investigation can begin. And so what was the star doing before it died? So let's focus on that time lapse that was spanning more than a decade of the supernova. And so this one is called SN 1987A. And astronomers were able to see this supernova in such incredible detail because of how astronomically close it was. And so notice how, as the time lapse progresses, that ring around the star gets brighter, or I guess I should say what used to be the star, it gets brighter. And that is the key to understanding what happened to the star before it exploded. So what's happening here is that material that rebounded from the star is running into a dense cloud of gas surrounding the star and causing it to glow brighter. And so that gas had to come from somewhere. And since it's in such close proximity to the star, or where that star was, that material probably came from the star before it died. And so we can use all of these telescopes to try and interview that light, and we can begin to put together a story. And so one witness that is always a huge help in what astronomers do is called a spectrum. And so spectra are typically done using optical light, same stuff that we see from the sun, but it can be done with other types of light. And so these help astronomers divide supernova into a classification system. And so basically what we're doing is that we look at a very specific wavelength of light and ask just how much of that specific wavelength is there. And so we get images like those red lines where we can see peaks and dips indicating a larger or a smaller amount of light at that exact wavelength. And those hold troves of information. In this image, each peak and dip is labeled with letters in a Roman numeral, which indicates exactly what element produced it, telling us exactly what was at the scene of the crime, like fingerprints on the murder weapon. But how can we be so sure about this? Well, you've probably heard of quantum mechanics as some far-fetched thing that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, and perhaps allowing time travel according to some movies. And while I can tell you that part is not true, it does help astronomers identify what elements we see in the spectrum, like the fingerprints identifying a suspect. And so let's take hydrogen, for example, since that's what most stars use as fuel. And so it's one proton, one electron, and they're attracted to each other because of electricity. The proton has a positive charge, the electron has a negative charge, opposite charges attract, and so they want to be next to each other. The electron orbits around the proton, kind of in a sense like the moon orbits the Earth, and it can orbit a bit farther away or a bit closer. But the key thing from quantum mechanics is that the electron is not allowed to orbit at just any distance. It has to be a very specific distance. And so another way to think about this is that it's like the electron is climbing a ladder. And it has to be on one of the rungs on the ladder. It can't be halfway up a rung. And so each rung corresponds to a very specific amount of energy the electron needs to have in order to be on that rung. And so it's like me knowing that in order to climb the hill to get to work every day, I need to have exactly one chocolate chip cookie in order to have enough energy to make it up the hill. And so for the electron, that chocolate chip cookie is light. And so in order to climb the ladder, it needs to be hit by light of exactly the right energy in order to climb up to the next rung. Or if the electron wants to climb down, it has to release light of exactly the energy difference between the two rungs it was on and the rung it ends up on. And the difference between each rung is unique to each type of atom, which makes them unique like fingerprints. And so there are some cases where we can infer something like that ring from the animation without seeing it directly, which is incredibly helpful because not all supernovae are going to explode so close by as this one. And so my research is about exactly that. It's been about a supernova called SN 2014C, and we saw in the first spectrum we took, there were no fingerprints for hydrogen. But then about 100 days later, we took another spectrum and suddenly hydrogen appeared. And so this is something that would happen if there were a ring of hydrogen like in 1987A, or perhaps a donut or even a thin-walled ball around what previously was a star. But how did that hydrogen gas get out there? Well, it must have come from the star. And so we know that all stars fused hydrogen together in their lives. And so if we do not see any hydrogen from that star, it must have gone somewhere. That hydrogen cannot just vanish. And then when the hydrogen appears in the spectrum later, it's quite likely that that is our missing hydrogen. And so what does this tell us? Well, the simple fact that there is now hydrogen gas surrounding the star that was once a part of the star indicates something very dramatic happened to remove the gas from the star. And so that can tell us about a lot of the internal or even external dynamics of the star. Specifically, the amount of gas that we see and how it's distributed are two major pieces of the puzzle. Think of it a lot like walking in to your young niece or nephew's birthday party where they just finished cutting the cake. If everyone's gotten a similar slice, they all like the flavor, everyone's happy, cake is neatly cut and placed on plates. However, if when you walk in, there is cake all over the walls, the children are crying, and the adult chaperone is rocking back and forth in the corner, something clearly very dramatic has just happened here. And so that dramatic thing is the star's tantrum. And so when stars do throw a tantrum, these are some of the explanations that astronomers have for how that hydrogen was removed from the star, or the culprits of this criminal investigation. And so on the left, we have what astronomers call binary interaction. And so binary means two, and the interaction means that the stars are influencing each other. And astronomers usually call these stars siblings. And so in this case, like any two siblings, binary interaction means that one sibling is stealing from the other. And so here that something is hydrogen gas. Essentially, what happens is one star gets puffed up and its hydrogen is very loosely held on by gravity. So when the other sibling gets close enough, it steals the hydrogen. And anything that isn't stolen directly from one star to the other is flung out into space, immediately surrounding the star, possibly making something like that ring from the animation. And then in the middle is an eruption-like event. And so these can happen very late in a star's life, and it's a domino effect of sorts, where one event leads to a chain reaction. And so perhaps within the star, there's maybe a big bubble of helium that falls towards the core. And when this bubble of helium hits the core, it ignites in a flash, which then sends a shock wave through the star. And then that ignites more gas, and that goes on to ignite even more gas, and so on until it reaches the edge of the star and it erupts, kind of like when you cook pasta sauce in a pot and watch it kind of bubble and snap. And then finally, there's the last possibility that the inside of a star is producing waves. And so the stellar interior is always churning around, causing material to go up and down. And it's a lot like if you're sitting in the bathtub. and you go back and forth and back and forth and make a giant wave like Calvin in this comic here. And so eventually those waves heat up the gas in the outermost layers because it's moving so much, like when your hands rub together and they begin to feel warm. And so that the gas gets so warm that it begins to escape and leave and creates those ring-like structures or shell-like structures from the around the stars. And so without ever traveling to the crime scene, armed with only a set of telescopes, we're able to understand what the star was doing shortly before exploding as a supernova and close this investigation. And so thank you for all of your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Thanks so much. That was really cool. All right. Again, we'll monitor any questions in the Q&A and chat.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, how do you get the time in? What's the data collection process like for getting these pictures?
So typically what happens is you go to the telescope, and the telescope has a committee, and you say, I would like to observe this particular phenomenon for X amount of time. And then here are the reasons why I want to do that, blah, 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 blah. And then the committee will either say, yes, great, that sounds like some awesome science. We want you to do that, and they'll give you the time. Or they'll say, maybe not this time, and they won't give you the time. But once you are granted the time, basically, depending on what kind of a telescope you're using, either you will be physically observing something, or basically it'll be all automated. When it comes to something like those very gigantic radio dishes, that's all automated. There's no way that one human being can control all of that. When it comes to like the observatories like Lick and Pan-STARRS that I was talking about, there are definitely people in the loop for that kind of a thing. You can do that. And then when it comes to the telescopes like Chandra and NuSTAR, the X-ray ones, those are actually way up in space. They're orbiting around the Earth. And so there are basically little rockets on them that kind of adjust where they're pointing. And so basically the mission control of sorts will push a button, tell it, go over here, stare at this space of sky for however long. And then once that's done, basically, you get a giant data file, and it has all the number of photons, the amount of light, the different kinds of light that you see. And from there, you do a whole bunch of analysis with a lot of software and a lot of computers.
Cool, thanks. That's really cool.
So if I could piggyback onto that, does that mean you generally know when a supernova is going to happen soon to book time? Or are you booking time and saying, point in this direction, I hope something happens?
So if we could know when a supernova was about to go off, that would make my life so much easier. The issue is that these kind of like fluctuations that we see are on scales that we're just not able to see because they're so far away normally. And so the most common way that we identify supernova is that, so there are some observatories where their entire job is basically scanning as much of the sky as they can. And so what they do is they have basically a quote unquote template where it's kind of like the generic, nothing really seems to be happening here image. And then every night they go back to that one spot, they take another image and they ask, what's different here? So they put together the two images. It's called image subtraction because you're literally subtracting the two images, seeing what's different about them. And then usually the interesting things are the supernova, and you'll see there's a big white dot where it's like, there's something that's new, there's something that's exciting. There are, of course, some other issues. There are some satellites that have been problems, and there are some other things that are not quite as interesting, but that's the main way that we go about finding these things.
Cool, thanks. And then there is a question in the chat. Diana is asking, so where do the other elements come from, the heavier elements inside the star?
The ones that are heavier than iron, usually that's actually going to be my next area of research beyond this. So
I
there
think it
are,
might mean heavier than helium too. Maybe, I guess, cover both in case
all
I
right.
don't think it was clarified. Yeah.
So elements that are between helium and irons, those are all produced within a star. And so I had mentioned, and this is only if the star is big enough, because a star like our sun is not massive enough to go through all of this process. But if it is sufficiently massive, it will fuse hydrogen into helium. Then once it builds up enough helium, it will fuse that helium together into carbon, then that carbon into things like oxygen and neon, and then that neon and into, I think it was magnesium after that, and you keep going down the line until you get to the iron. Because like I said, that is the death sentence for a star. That is when it starts absorbing energy as opposed to producing it. But if the question was for items
Yeah,
heavier,
she did clarify. It looks like she was asking about heavier than iron. So you are good to.
all right. So heavier than iron, that is an area of research that's very interesting right now. So there are basically two main things that can happen. When the supernova explodes, it does produce a lot of, it is kind of an instantaneous burning point where it does make some heavier elements. But the vast majority of them are produced by an entirely separate pathway, which I know, at least since I'm embedded in the astronomy world, this was a huge deal in 2017. If anybody has heard of the laser interferometry gravitational wave observatories over in 2017, there was the first time that we ever saw gravitational waves. I can get into those more if people are curious about that. But basically, the way we get a lot of those really heavy elements is there's an object called a neutron star, which is something that can be produced by the supernova. Basically, it's the dead remnant of what the star of what was once the star. And so these are incredibly dense objects. The typical measurement is if you were to take a teaspoon of them, they would weigh about, I think it was somewhere around the hundreds of thousands of elephants, if I remember correctly. 1 teaspoon. It is so incredibly packed and dense. And so these objects can collide, and once they collide, they produce all of these heavy elements. They produce a lot of that, a lot of gold, platinum. I can try to find, there's a really good image that's been made that I can try to send maybe to the Popping the Science Bubble people.
Yeah, we can include it in our newsletter, the follow-up newsletter. That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, it shows the whole periodic table and where all the elements come from by like fractions. And so all this heavy element stuff, that is purely from these neutron stars colliding and forming all of these elements, almost all of them.
And then I have a question kind of related. Obviously, in a very simplistic and for the most part, the elements that are like in their own sphere, so the hydrogen sphere and then the helium sphere, will fuse with a same element to make kind of the next rung. But I would assume at the interface, is there ability for some amount of like hydrogen helium fusion or helium carbon fusion to make different elements, or are they only fusing with the same elements?
The vast majority of them are with the same elements. That it does happen like a little bit, but like not a whole lot. The best example is probably carbon, because what tends to happen is like the official, I've kind of glossed over a bit of all the nuclear reactions that are happening. But the best example there is there's one particular process where like it's called the CNO cycle because it's carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and basically it's getting pelted with helium and hydrogen, and it kind of forms a circle as you add these individual hydrogen and helium atoms to it to form those heavier elements. But there's not a whole lot of mixing beyond that.
Cool. So I feel like I've read news about somewhere that people have tried to predict the lifetime of our sun and our solar system. And I was interested to hear that you said our sun isn't big enough to like make all of the heavy elements. So basically at the death of our sun, which is not within our lifetime.
Oh no, far away.
What can you all predict what elements you would expect to see then, like in the spectra that you were talking about, or is it unknown what you would expect to see?
So we can predict that basically our sun is going to it is basically going to get up to the point where it can fuse into carbon and oxygen. I don't remember which one of those two specifically. I think it's either carbon or oxygen. And so effectively what's going to happen is that it is going to continue on its merry way, fusing hydrogen for all this time. And it's going to fuse the helium into carbon and so on. But it's not going to be big enough to heat and fuse the carbon and oxygen any further. And so pretty much what's going to happen out of that is the outer layers are just kind of going to slowly drift away, and it's going to leave like just that kind of a bit of that hot, dense carbon or oxygen core. And so that's going to be the main components out of that. But also I would like to specify that we will see other heavier elements than that in the star, because there have been stars and supernova that have happened before our star was born, and then those produced the heavier elements, and kind of enrich the universe around them with all these heavier elements. And so we'll still see, like, traces of those, not a whole lot, but still some of it in our sun once it eventually reaches the end of its life.
Okay, that's cool to hear. And I think that relates to Diana's question about, is our sun a third generation star? So does that kind of relate to how you're saying there were supernova stars before our sun then?
Yeah, so I think what you might be referring to is, so there's this term called population 3 stars, which are basically exactly like our sun. There have been a lot of generations previously before that. There's a lot of weird naming conventions in astronomy. I'm going to be completely honest about that. And so you would think that maybe population 1 would be the newest, but not so much. They're actually the oldest. And so nobody's actually ever seen a population 1 star, because basically those were around at the very beginning of the universe, and that's it. Because a population 1 star is basically, it is pure helium and hydrogen. In those stars, we wouldn't see any of the heavier elements from previous supernova explosions at all. It would literally just be pure helium and hydrogen. That's it. And then population 2, if I remember correctly, is like a little bit. And then I think population 3 is what our sun is considered.
Thank you. And I'm going to shift gears abruptly because I remembered a question I had for Eric about one of your slides with your data showing the circular map, and there were like 2 circles on top of each other in a grid, and you were saying that, yeah, you were able to like map the connections and it looked like it was highlighted. And I was just wondering, I guess, why were there 2 circles on top of one another? Like, yeah, because I
so let me just pull that figure back up. just so we're all on the same page here. So I didn't do a great job of explaining this. I realized, let me go ahead and share this. So what you're looking at here, each one of these circles is, essentially a trip around the circle. So they're offset just for visualization. So, they're separated by time. But what you're seeing here on each one of these is sort of the activity profile of an individual neuron. So, for instance, this neuron didn't really do anything until it got to the very end of the lap, where it fired. Okay, so that would be its sort of place field within this cognitive space. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. So basically each pair of circles represents a different neuron, like
A single neuron. That's right. That's right.
Oh, wow. Okay. And sorry, then a follow-up. How do you track a neuron? I guess, like, do you have those wires on people's heads or?
Yeah, so you're basically putting electrodes in and you're just recording the sort of ongoing activity. This has been sort of chopped up and processed in different ways to sort of get this visualization. But as the data are coming in, it's just sort of a stream of digitized, highly amplified signals from within the brain.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I'm sorry to jump back here, but I was like, oh man, that question is bothering me, those circles. So.
I did quickly look up the population 1, 2, and 3 stars, and I did have it mixed up, so that's my fault. Our sun is a population 1, so then, and then population 3 is the pure hydrogen and helium. That was my bad.
But it seems we're on the 3rd iteration of stars, so to speak. Or 3rd level of stars. Iteration may be wrong.
There's really no way to tell so much as to know what generation of stars we're on. We can make estimates, but beyond that, there isn't much of a definitive. We know for sure this is the 5th generation of stars that has happened or whatever.
Well, all right. Thank you both very much. These are super cool talks and obviously leading to a lot of more interesting questions and further curiosities. So thank you for stimulating such a great discussion. I think we've all learned a lot and been very, very interested in these talks. So thank you for coming in.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Great talks. And to the audience too, be sure to check these out on YouTube. They'll be later uploaded. And have a good evening.
All right, thanks everybody.
Great. Have a great evening.